the wall here, right here.
Please spell your name for the record.
Yes, Marrisa Francisco, M-A-R-R-I-S-A, last name F-R-A-N-C-I-S-C.
You do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes, I do.
All right, you're going to walk around the court reporter. Have a seat just to my left here.
Would you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Yes, my name is Marrisa Francisco, and I am a forensic scientist with the City of Chandler in the Forensic Services section.
How long have you worked there?
I have worked there since August of 2018. Previous to that, I was employed at the Arizona Department of Public Safety, and I started there in 2004.
So let's kind of go back. What did you do at the Department of Public Safety, DPS?
I started my career in the blood alcohol unit, so my duty there was to test blood for the presence of alcohol. I was in that unit for about 7 years. After that, I transferred to the trace evidence unit, where I was trained to do hair comparisons and fiber comparisons. After that, about 2016, 2017, I started training in the latent print unit. In August 2018, I completed my training at the City of Chandler and have been doing latent print analysis primarily at the City of Chandler.
Can you tell us the training and your education to be a latent print analyst?
Yes, I have a Bachelor's of Science in Biochemistry from the University of California at Los Angeles and a Master's of Science in Forensic Science from the University of Illinois at Chicago. As part of my training for latent prints, it was an extensive 1.5 year long program where there was readings, lectures, comparison exercises, oral boards, and a competency test. I also have to conduct and complete a proficiency test on latent print comparisons on an annual basis. I am also a certified latent print examiner. In order to obtain the certification, I had to complete over 160 hours of certified training and pass a comprehensive exam.
Thank you. So we talk about latent prints. We're thinking of people's fingers. Where do we find latent prints on people?
Yes, let me start with defining what friction ridge skin is. Friction ridge skin are raised ridges on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. They are specialized and only located in those two areas. We often have oils and sweat and other residues on our hands, and when we touch an item, we can leave an impression of our friction ridge detail on that item.
Is that what most of us call latent prints, or I left a print behind?
Yes, fingerprints.
You started to talk about oils and things. Do people always leave behind a print if they touch an object?
It actually depends on a lot of different things. First off, the amount of oils and residues on our hands will determine whether an impression is left. Also, the deposition pressure meaning are we gently tapping on something or are we like really pushing down on it? That will affect whether an impression is left and the quality of that print. The item itself is very important. Is it something that is receptive to prints? Items that are smooth, like glass, I am more likely to find a print on an item like that versus something that is textured and rough, like a cinder block. I would not expect to find a lane print on a cinder block. The condition of the item is also important. How many people may have come in contact with that item. All these different things affect whether an impression is left and the quality of that impression. We can very simply think of a stamp, our fingers being the stamps, the oils being the ink, and depending on how the stamp is placed on different items will determine how that impression looks.
Can environment also impact the quality of or whether or not a print remains?
Yes, the environment is also important. After a print is left, is it left out to the conditions of rain or does it get wet? Is there a dust storm? Is it in an area that it has high traffic? Like if a fingerprint is left on a door to a convenience store and 100 people go through there that day, impressions are left, but if I lift those prints, I might not be able to identify them because there are so many prints on top of each other.
And so that goes to the next thing. So are prints something that once you make it, it's permanent and there forever?
It is there until it is disturbed, so it can be there forever.
Can we wipe them away?
Yes,
Can they be smudged away?
they can, yes.
So can someone rubbing an object, like a smooth object, get rid of that?
Yes.
Are there different ways or different processes that you use to obtain latent prints or friction-ridge detail off of an object?
Yes, there are. First off, I want to define what a non-porous item is. A non-porous item is an item where water or air cannot pass through it. So when I first receive an item, I determine whether it is porous or non-porous because depending on that, I will use different processing techniques.
So for a non-porous item, what processes do you use to try to find friction-rich detail?
Yes. On non-porous items, the main processing technique that I use is called cyanoacrylate fuming, more commonly known as superglue fuming. So items are exposed to superglue fumes, and the fumes react to any oils and sweat in the latent print, creating a white visible print that is not readily destroyed.
So you've looked at the non-porous item. You don't see any prints on. Do you look visually first?
Yes, sorry. The very first thing we do is I look at the request sheet and see what items are needing to be tested in that case. And also I look to see what the requesting officer wants done with the case. Sometimes they are requesting that the item be swabbed for DNA. If an item is requested to be swabbed for DNA, I have to use clean techniques to help reduce and limit contamination. So clean techniques are when I bleach down all surfaces with bleach, I lay down a clean butcher paper, I use sterile equipment. I'm only analyzing and working with one item at a time, and I'm changing gloves between items to help prevent contamination. So if a request sheet requests DNA evidence, I will have to use clean techniques before I swab the item for DNA. After that, I will do a visual examination of the item. Before any processing techniques are conducted, I will take a flashlight and look at the item to see if I can see any latent prints with a flashlight. If I can see a visible print at this point, depending on the quality of that print, I will take a picture or lift that latent before I move on to any processes. So after each processing technique, I will have to document what I find with either photography, scanning on a scanner, or lifting with powder.
So you talked about photographing these latent prints. How do you do that? Like how do you take a photograph of that to ensure it's the right size or shape or whatever, so you can later use it for a comparison?
Yes, I have training and experience in taking photographs. So in the photograph, I have to have a scale in it. So I have a scale with the case number, and I am just trained to properly use the lighting I need, adjust the lighting, focus it correctly, have it level with the lens of the camera, and I take a picture and document where on the item the photograph was taken.
Okay. So how do you just told us you document where on the item the picture was taken. How do you do that so that you can later go back and say it's in the middle of a mirror or whatever it might be?
Yes, I try to be as clear and concise as possible, because like I said, I have to take a picture after every single step. So I have to take a picture if there is any latent print of the visible step. And then if I go on to doing the super glue fuming, I have to take a picture of that same latent. If I go on to another process called dye staining, which we apply our fluorescent dye to even better visualize the image, I have to take that same latent again. So it helps me out to be able to go to find that latent. So I try to be specific on where that latent was found.
Do you, when you are processing a non-porous item and you find what I'll call a partial print or something that looks like friction ridge detail, do you collect it, or do you say right then and there, I don't think that would be useful?
Yes. So when I am examining an item, at that stage, my conclusions are either no latents observed, meaning I didn't see any friction ridge detail at all, no value latents, meaning I did see some friction ridge detail, but I don't believe that I can do anything or compare them at a later point, or latents for analysis. So if I find sufficient, clear, latent print detail, I will take a picture of it. If I'm not sure, I go ahead and take a picture of it, because at this point, I am not really determining whether the print is identifiable. I am just saying that I'm taking this picture and I want to do further analysis on it at a later point.
So then for the analysis, are you then, after you process an item and you recover any latent prints that may be useful or which are you later asked to ever compare those recovered prints to known prints?
Yes.
What do we mean by a known print?
Yes. So a known print is known fingerprints that are collected from an individual. They're typically recorded electronically or with ink. So in my comparisons, I am always comparing a latent impression that was recovered or developed versus a exemplar, and I'm trying to determine whether or not the latent could have originated from that exemplar, or whether or not those two impressions could have been made by the same individual.
Can you tell us briefly, when you are looking at this recovered latent print and comparing it to a known, what are you looking for to be able to make an identification?
I will explain what methodology we use for latent print comparisons. It is called ACE-V, which stands for Analysis, Comparison, Evaluation, and Verification. So in the analysis phase, I'm taking an assessment of the latent and the exemplar and determining whether or not they are suitable for comparison. If I determine they are suitable for comparison, I move on to the comparison phase. This is when I'm observing two impressions and I'm looking for the existence of similarities, differences, or discrepancies. Next is the evaluation phase. At this point, I am rendering a conclusion based on my analysis and comparison. The three different conclusions that can be reached are identification, exclusion, and inconclusive. So identification is the determination that the two impressions originated from the same person. Exclusion is the determination that the two impressions, the latent and the known, were not created by the same individual or they do not have the same source. Lastly, I have a conclusion of inconclusive, and this is where I can neither identify nor exclude the individual from having made the print. So going back to analysis, during the analysis phase, I am looking at a lot of different things. First off, I'm trying to determine, is the print from a finger or is it from part of the palm? And also I'm determining the orientation of the print. If it's from the palm, I can also, depending on the ridge flow in the latent print, I can determine what area of the palm it came from. I'm looking at the shape of the impression. Like sometimes you have like a C-shaped impression, and that's this part of the palm. So this is called the writer's palm, and that's where I would look first when I'm doing a comparison. So besides that, I am looking at level 1, level 2, and level 3 detail. Level 1 detail is the actual flow or pattern of the ridges. Our fingers have 3 main patterns, which are loops, whorls, and arches. Next, I'm looking at second level detail. I'm looking at the ridge characteristics. So I'm looking at where the ridges end, which we call ridge endings. I'm examining where ridges split into 2 ridges, which are called bifurcations. And I'm marking any dots, which are very short ridges. So I'm examining the latent and I'm marking up all these second level details so that I can later compare to the exemplar. I'm also noting if there's any scars present in the latent. I'm noting if there's some creases or if there are issues with the deposition pressure or if there seems to be some movement in the latent. I'm documenting all of that stuff in the analysis phase of my analysis.
Let me leave that with her.
Okay.
You recognize Exhibit 249 as an item that you were provided and asked to process to see if you could recover any latent prints or friction ridge detail. Sorry. I know, it's a little awkward.
Yes, I do recognize this item.
And were you provided with that Exhibit 249, that bat, and asked to try to recover any latent prints from that bat?
Yes, I was.
Can you tell us, in this Exhibit 249, what did you do to attempt to recover any, and did you recover any latent prints?
Yes, on the request, it was also requested that I process the item with clean techniques because it was also requested that I swab the item for DNA. So I already went through that process and explained that. So I used clean techniques to process this item. And the very first thing I did when I opened up the packaging was I swabbed the textured grip for potential DNA. The reason I swabbed the grip first is because of the texture on that grip, I would not expect to find latent prints on the grip. So I didn't feel that I was potentially ruining any prints because I don't feel that there would be fingerprints on that textured grip. So that was the very first thing I did. And then I did a visual examination of the bat with a flashlight to see if there were any visible prints at that point. And I don't believe there were, but I would have to check my notes.
But looking at your notes, help refresh your recollection as to whether or not you did find anything there.
Yes,
Do you have your notes up with you?
yes.
If you want to take a look at those and then let us know when you're done if that has refreshed your recollection. Did that refresh your recollection?
Yes, so at the visible stage, my conclusion was that there were no latents observed at the visual stage.
I'm going to put Exhibit 35 up here just so that we can all kind of see what we're talking about. So the gripped part here is what you were talking about that you swabbed because you did not believe that prints would be recoverable on that texture that was on the bat?
Correct.
Okay. So then you visually look, you don't observe any latent prints or friction ridge detail?
Correct.
What did you do next?
I then used a processing technique of superglue fuming.
And when you used that process, did you locate or recover any latent prints or friction ridge detail?
Yes, I did.
Can you tell us how many and where?
Yes, I recovered 2 impressions that I took pictures of, and I would have to look at my notes to refresh where they were collected from.
If looking at your notes would help refresh as to where you located those, please do so and then let us know when you've been refreshed.
I'm ready.
Where did you locate those 2?
The first one was recovered in the W of the Rawlings that was above the diameter. I think Rawlings is also on the other side. So that's why I stated that it was the one that was right above where the diameter is. And the second one was recovered in between the G and the diameter.
Now, you told us that what you are recovering isn't always look like a finger, right? When you were recovering these latent prints, were you able to tell by just recovering them if it was a finger or, like you told us, a palm? When you looked at it, were you able to immediately identify where they came from?
They appear to be fingerprints.
Was there anything about the shape or, I guess, the shape of them that made you think that they were fingerprints?
The first image, it was just the shape of the impression just indicated to me that it was a fingerprint, the size of it, indicated to me that it was a fingerprint.
Was the other one, the second print, slightly, I guess, not as clear on whether or not it was a fingerprint or potentially from some other area?
Correct.
Okay. Were you asked to then compare those two? Well, let me ask you, when you obtained these two, you told us there were 3 different levels. Obviously, you collected something. Did you believe these were able to make identifications, or what did you determine about the clarity, the detail of those 2 recovered prints?
For both impressions, in my analysis, I determined that both impressions were NVID, which stands for no value for identification. This means that the latents lack sufficient clarity, quantity, and or uniqueness to identify, but may be suitable for exclusion. So the impressions were possibly excludable, but I would not be able to identify who made those impressions.
So were you initially asked to try to identify them to 3 individuals?
Yes, I was first asked to compare the 2 impressions to 3 individuals.
And who were those 3 individuals?
Could I look at my notes, please?
Yes, if that would help refresh your recollection.
Yes, I was initially asked to compare the 3 impressions to a Charles Vallow, a Lori Vallow, and an Alexander Cox.
So you told us, though, they were of no value for identification. So did that sort of end that request?
Yes, so when there is only prints that are determined to be no value for identification, we routinely do not compare those prints, but we say, if you still want us to compare it to anyone, please let us know. But initially, we are not going to try to compare NVID prints to any individual because they cannot be identified.
So did you then, were you then requested to see if you could make any exclusions?
I was then requested to compare the 2 impressions to Charles Vallow to see if I can determine whether the 2 impressions did not originate from Charles Vallow.
Starting with the first impression that you found above the W, but the other side of the bat from what we see in 35 here, where there's a diameter marking, were you able to reach any conclusions in looking at the prints from Charles Vallow and that recovered print?
Again, I went through the ACE-V process, and during the comparison phase and evaluation phase, I determined that the the first latent, was inconclusive to Charles Vallow, meaning that I could neither identify nor exclude him from having made the impression.
So does that just mean there's just not enough in that print to do anything with?
Correct. So there is not, it lacks sufficient agreement in the detail to identify, and it lacks sufficient disagreement in the impressions to exclude.
And is that common when you have a latent print that just doesn't seem to have the level of detail just necessary for that?
Yes, that is a common conclusion.
So you're not saying it's Charles, you're not saying it's not Charles, you just can't do anything with it?
I could neither identify or exclude Charles Vallow.
So for the second print, did you also attempt to compare that to latent prints from Charles Vallow?
Yes, I did.
And were you able to reach any conclusions as to that?
Yes, my conclusion was that the latent was inconclusive to Charles Vallow due to lack of detail in the latent and exemplar.
Were you ever asked to try to exclude Alex Cox as having made those latent prints?
No, After I initially did not compare the latents to the 3 individuals on the name comparison, I was only asked to compare the 2 impressions to Charles Vallow.
So you also weren't asked to try to exclude or secondary compare to a Lori Vallow?
No, I was not.
And were you ever asked to compare to a Tylee Ryan?
No, I was not.
Did that sort of end your processing and comparisons of this bat?
Yes.
Thank you. I have no other questions for this witness.
Cross.
I have one question, Your Honor. You said earlier that the DNA that you collected, was that ever tested?
I don't know.
Is it sent somewhere else?
Correct. So
Okay.
the city of Chandler does not have the capability to test for DNA. Anytime we swab for DNA, we send it to the state lab for analysis.
So you swabbed it and sent it to the lab, and that was the last you heard of it?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, that's all.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
Any questions for this witness from any member of the jury? I don't see any, so you can step down, ma'am. I think this is a good time to take our afternoon recess. We'll be at recess for